Mr. President, since I was sworn into office this January, about 6 months ago, the House and the Senate have both been understandably, properly concerned with one issue that has perhaps eclipsed every other issue that has come before us in this half-year period of time. That related to our national debt and the anticipated expiration of our debt limit, which will hit in just a couple of weeks. Many Americans are understandably concerned and have articulated the concern that if we pass the debt limit deadline of August 2nd without raising the debt limit, there could be catastrophic financial consequences. In light of that, I, along with a number of my Republican colleagues, both in the Senate and in the House, have introduced legislation called the Cut, Cap, and Balance Act to address the debt limit, to address it head on. And it says that we'll raise the debt limit if three conditions are met. First, if we make significant cuts to domestic discretionary spending for the fiscal year 2012 budget. Second, we need statutory spending caps to put us on a smooth but steady glide path toward balancing our budget sometime within the next decade. Third, we need a balanced budget amendment passed out of Congress and submitted to the states for ratification. We think all three of these steps are necessarily required before we take the significant additional step of raising the debt limit, because of the fact that it took us a long time to get to this point, to the point where by the end of the year we will have accumulated $15 trillion in debt, about $50,000 for every man, woman, and child in America, and between $120,000 and $150,000 for every wage earner in America. This is a lot of money. Before we extend that debt limit, again by an additional $2.4 trillion, we have to solve the problem. We have to address the problem that led to its creation in a real, lasting, binding, fundamental way. That's why the most critical part of this legislation, while each part is important, happens to be found in that which rests upon the idea of a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. You see, because we, as members of Congress, could decide right now that over the next 10 years or 15 years, that it might be a good idea to cut spending by $2 trillion, $3 trillion, 4, 5, 6, perhaps more. But if we made that promise today as a down payment to the American people, in exchange for the permission of the people to raise the debt limit, it's a promise that we can't really make good on, because we can't bind a future Congress. This Congress was sworn in January of 2011. Elections will be held in November of 2012, and a new Congress will be sworn in based on those elections in January 2013. The same thing will happen again in January of 2015 and every 2 years after that for the duration of our republic. The decisions that we make right here, right now, can affect the here and now and can be binding for the here and now. But we can't reasonably expect, and we can't ask the American people, when making a decision so long-lasting and precedent-setting as this one, to simply trust us that future Congresses will see things the same way that we do. The only way that we can bind a future Congress is by amending our law of laws. That 224-year-old document, painstakingly ironed out by some of the brightest men of the last several centuries in Philadelphia 224 years ago. When we amend the Constitution, we make it possible to bind a future Congress, and that's what we need to do. Now, we've had some interesting debate and discussion surrounding this proposal. Last Friday, I listened with surprise and dismay as our president said, we don't need to amend the Constitution to require a balanced budget, but we do need to balance our budget. In the president's opinion, Congress just needs to do its job, not amend the Constitution. I think I understand his point. I think he's suggesting that for Congress to do its job, it needs to balance its budget. But I have to ask the question, how has that worked out for us? Have past Congresses balanced their budgets? Has the current Congress balanced its budget? Overwhelmingly, the answer is no. It happens every now and again. Some would describe those instances where it has balanced in the last 2 or 3 decades as an accident, others a momentary blip. Still others would suggest that it was the product of accounting gimmickry rather than an actual act of budget balancing when that occurred. But regardless, we know that balanced federal budgets are newsworthy indeed because they're very rare. I look forward to the day when they're no longer newsworthy, when they're customary. And the only way to make them customary, based on our experience as Americans throughout most of our nation's history, is by amending the Constitution to require it, to make this a binding and permanent law. I was shocked and dismayed again to learn that our Senate Majority Leader, Senator Reid from Nevada, stated just a few hours ago that he doesn't like this legislation. He made some very disparaging comments about it, notwithstanding the fact and completely ignoring the fact that this isn't just the best legislation to address the debt limit issue. Right now, it's the only legislation. It is the only legislation that addresses this issue that is moving through Congress, that's been reduced to legislative language. Certainly the only one that's been passed by one body of Congress and is now moving over to the United States Senate. And so he's criticizing something when he himself hasn't offered anything up. This is the only show in town. And given how close we now are to the August 2nd deadline, in part because we punted this so long, in part because we haven't been having the debate and the discussion in Congress that we should have been having for months, this is it. This is the only proposal. Now, if Senator Reid has suggestions on how we might change this proposal, I'm all ears. I'd love to hear what they are. If he has his own proposal, I'd love to see what that is. But simply to stand from that desk over there and disparage this legislation is inexcusable, absolutely inexcusable, given the fact that he has offered nothing. Let me read some of his words. He said, "The American people should understand that this meaning the Cut, Cap, and Balance Act, is a bad piece of legislation, perhaps some of the worst legislation in the history of this country." I don't know what he's referring to. He didn't give specifics, nor has he given any specifics on what he would like to see in its place or how it could be improved. So my suggestion to our Senate Majority Leader is, if you've got ideas, please put them on the table. Because as we approach this debt limit deadline, we're running out of time. The clock has been ticking for 6 months. We've known this was going to happen. This is not news to us. So why then has there been so little debate and discussion in this body? Why is it that we spent weeks and weeks and weeks often dealing with legislation that paled in comparison to the importance of this issue? The clock kept ticking, and we kept debating and discussing other legislation far, far less important. This, in my opinion, was a gross dereliction of duty. But we've still got a few weeks. We can still deal with it. We can still address it. I suggest strongly that we address it by starting with that legislation that has actually been proposed and that we have full debate and discussion. But no, we're told. Even after the House of Representatives earlier this week passed the Cut, Cap, and Balance Act, passed it with bipartisan support, by the way. No fewer than 5 members of the Democratic caucus in the House of Representatives voted to support this. So that was passed Tuesday night. We were told later that we'd be having a vote on Saturday or perhaps Monday. And then just a little while ago, we were informed by the Senate Majority Leader that the vote would be tomorrow, giving us little or no time for actual debate and discussion on the floor of what is still to this moment the only legislation moving through to address this issue. Now, this is not an appropriate moment for demagoguery. Demagoguery on an issue this important can result in a lot of unnecessary pain. No one disputes that there could be significant negative economic consequences associated with not raising the debt limit. I don't dispute that, not for a moment. That's exactly why I put my neck on the line in order to file this legislation, because nothing else was moving forward. I didn't want to do it, but when I was sworn in as a U.S. Senator just a few months ago, I understood that it was my obligation to do what I could to make things better, to make our constitutional system work. So I filed it. It's an insult not only to me and to my colleagues, but to all Americans when addressing an issue this important. To have so little debate and discussion over this issue, I find it appalling. I find it reprehensible. I demand an explanation, and I demand an alternative solution if the Senate Majority Leader is going to pick this apart and say that he won't do it. Moreover, I will remind the Senate Majority Leader that just a few short years ago, in 2006, when we had a different president belonging to a different party, and this body was in control of another party, if my memory serves me correctly, not only did then Senator Barack Obama vote against raising the debt limit, calling the need to do so the product of a failure of leadership that he wasn't willing to condone and perpetuate, but every single one of his Democratic colleagues joined him in that vote. Not one of them voted to raise the debt limit. So here we are again, approaching the debt limit. Here we are again, with only Republicans stepping up to the plate and offering a solution. Only this time, the solution is a permanent one. Unfortunately, in 2006, and in prior and in subsequent debt limit extension votes, there was no serious debate attached to it as to a permanent solution. We have to amend the governing document, the law of laws, the only kind of law that can bind future Congresses in order to solve this problem. We have to do it now. This is part of what it means to be an American. We as Americans crave liberty, and we eschew tyranny to any degree. Every single time we authorize deficit spending, we fuel the unfettered expansion of the federal government and all of its power. We commit ourselves and our posterity to a future that will include working more and more hours and days and weeks and even months just to pay their federal tax bills every single year. That's time that they won't get back. That's time that we won't get back. That erodes our individual liberty. It also erodes our liberty when the same regulatory structure that exists today grows bigger and bigger every year, because we're borrowing now more than $1.5 trillion every single year. Not because of some aberrational condition, some unusual development that requires an unusual expenditure of borrowed money, but just to cover our basic day-to-day operations. This is what fuels the perpetual expansion of government, and when government expands perpetually, our individual liberty is diminished severely, unfortunately, and to a corresponding degree. This is unacceptable. But there is a way home. The way home is found in limiting the role of government. And you can limit the role of government most effectively at this point in time, I believe, by limiting the pool of money to which Congress has access. The only way to do that is through a constitutional amendment. I want to close by addressing one final argument that's sometimes been used in response to and against the Cut, Cap, and Balance Act. Many of its detractors are making a claim that I find extraordinary, a claim that says, why are you even supporting this because it can't pass? It's a little bit like saying, why do we even play the Super Bowl when it's expected that one team is going to beat the other team? You have to play, but this one isn't a game. This one is for real. And when we vote, after debating and discussing, members of this body can and will be held accountable to our constituents. So it will be up to me and each of my colleagues in this body to decide how to vote on this issue. For those who make the unfortunate decision to vote against this, notwithstanding the fact that 75% of the American people strongly support the idea of a balanced budget amendment, notwithstanding the fact that 66% of Americans, both of these figures according to a CNN poll released today, support the principles underlying cut, cap, and balance. Notwithstanding the fact that this is the only permanent way of solving our debt problem, if members of Congress and members of this body choose to vote against this legislation, they'll do so, I believe, at their own peril. They'll have to face their constituents and explain why a handful of them were unwilling to raise the debt limit, unwilling to address this problem, unwilling to fix the perpetual deficit spending habit of Congress, simply because they did not want a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. I think that's a tall order. I think that's difficult to explain. I think those who try to make that explanation to their constituents will do so at their own political peril. But more importantly, the vote they cast will be at the peril of the people of the United States of America, of their liberty, of their economic stability, and of their ability to prosper now and in the future. We can turn this ship around, but in order to do it, we need robust debate and discussion. And our constituents deserve more. The American people deserve more than to have the kind of sleight of hand scheduling and the kind of dismissive cavalier attitude toward what is being characterized correctly by many as the fight of an entire generation. We need to pass the Cut, Cap, and Balance Act. It's not only the best solution, it's the only solution. The time's running out, and I urge each of my colleagues to support this.